Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Emily Jaworski Koriath, and I'm currently serving as Assistant Professor of Voice at the University of Alabama at Birmingham. It is a joy to be here with you today to talk about my favorite thing, my research passion, which is trauma-informed vocal pedagogy. This is a topic that's been getting a lot of traction in the singing world lately, and that's because, as a colleague related to me recently, new data suggests that your next student is more likely to be carrying nervous system trauma than they are to be left-handed. Let that sink in for just a second. It can feel enormous to consider that students are carrying nervous system trauma when we haven't really investigated this topic ourselves or done any exploration into our own healing. This presentation is called Tools from Trauma Healing because voice teachers are not therapists, and I'm not asking anyone to act in a way that is beyond our ethical scope of practice. But by considering that a nervous system is an essential component of a singing body, we can start to update our perspective on the students before us and serve them with greater efficacy. So, what is trauma and why should we care? My favorite working definition of trauma is that it occurs in the nervous system anytime that we're presented with more than we can process in real time. That could be more noise, more sound, more light, or more violence, more impact. A car accident can cause nervous system trauma. A routine medical procedure, even if it goes well by medical standards, can cause nervous system trauma. There are millions of causes, and there's no cut and dry list of stimuli that lead to trauma. That is determined solely by the body involved in the incident. As voice teachers, we are not required to heal our students' trauma, and please don't try to do that. In the interest of disclosure, I'd like to share that I am almost done with my certification to become a somatic experiencing practitioner. And so I do work with clients one-on-one in a dedicated trauma healing capacity. However, I do not practice trauma healing on my undergraduate students because to do so without their consent would be unethical and dangerous. But I carry my updated knowledge of nervous systems at work into the studio and do my best to create an environment that is friendly to the overwhelmed nervous system, knowing that it's more likely than not that the students before me will have some sort of history of trauma, either developmental trauma that happens in infancy as we're working to create mammalian bonding relationships, or what we identify as shock trauma, something that comes from a very specific event like an accident or a procedure or something else. The work that we already do as teachers of singing with our students on interoception is hugely beneficial. Giving students the tools to notice what's happening in their own bodies is a hallmark of the somatic experiencing modality. We help people release stuck energy in the nervous system by giving them the tools and a frame to notice what's happening on the inside and to allow that energy to process. Part of what happens to create trauma is that we're presented with, for example, I'll use the example of an airport because I'm about to fly to Milwaukee tomorrow. Being in an airport could be a traumatic experience for someone, especially if they've got sensory processing issues or just have a highly sensitive nervous system. So the lights, the sounds, the number of people, the various smells of the food vendors, all the different places you can go, combined with movement on a tram or an escalator, or all of these things can contribute to someone feeling completely overwhelmed in the moment. But giving someone the tools to notice what's happening on the inside and make some choices about how to proceed in this highly stimulating environment helps us move from sort of this passive victim mentality of all these things are happening and I have no choice about what to do, to making some allowances for these are the types of things that seem to really set me off. And here are a few things I've learned that help me to process these things when I'm feeling overwhelmed. We get into trouble and set the conditions for trauma to be stored when we don't allow ourselves to feel what we feel. This is across the board culturally. We're so used to feeling, for example, if you have ever tripped on a curb in front of people, normally our response is we trip on a curb and maybe depending on who we are, we make a little joke about, oh gosh, whatever we make a joke about. And then we try to shut down whatever it is we're feeling so that nobody knows that we're bothered by what has just happened. Authentically, for some people, it might be beneficial to trip on the curb and take a deep breath and just allow that wave of excitation and that feeling of panic to pass through the system. The energy gets stuck when we trip on the curb, we feel the panic, we make a joke, we try to act like nothing's wrong, we go into the meeting with our colleagues, we look at the agenda, we try to process, and we have never made space to actually discharge the activation that occurred when we tripped on the curb. Objectively, tripping on a curb is a pretty small stimulus, but especially if my nervous system is already carrying the effects of developmental trauma and or shock trauma, that event can cause sort of I'm trapped in the Marvel universe, and so I'm thinking of a branch reality. A branch reality where suddenly I am working exclusively from my coping mechanisms. So if we carry that analogy and we think about me in the meeting with everybody after I've stubbed my toe on the curb and kind of embarrassed myself in front of everyone, I am now in a meeting operating from a place that is not my authentic self. Perhaps my mind is not clear. Perhaps I am not processing information as quickly or in the ways that my brain normally does, because the traumatic experience is altering my brain chemistry in that moment. And you can imagine if this becomes my habit, and I don't do anything to address what's gone on, it may be that every time I end up in a meeting, I go into this shutdown place where I'm trying to manage myself and I'm only working from this sort of disrupted physiology. This happens to our students. And one of my favorite things to remind teachers is, yes, we are not therapists. However, we are undeniably in the feelings business. Anytime you ask a student to connect with a poem or to feel something more deeply or to try and communicate more authentically, we're asking them to tap into this system. And so what I'm arguing is that in order to do so with more care, more compassion, and more skill, it's incumbent upon us as teachers to fill in some of these gaps, to make ourselves aware of nervous system processing and how it can be impacting our students' artistry. The number one tool, in addition to our leadership through the process of developing interoception, is allowing more time for students to process your instructions, to process their attempts at technical mastery, to process jury feedback, audition results, to process a performance. As I mentioned in my silly example of tripping on the sidewalk, something happens and culturally we don't give ourselves time to feel it, to experience it, to notice it. This is a huge life skill, and especially as we're thinking of developing complete artists, What we ask them to do or give them time to do or model for them in the studio then becomes something they carry with them as they move forward. So in check-in time, when a student comes into the lesson, ask them how they are. Some students, when they're developing this capacity, will just say, fine, or good. And what that shows me is they're not connected all the way into their internal experience, or they're having a deep internal experience and they don't feel safe enough yet to share it with me, which is something to be honored. So rather than going for vague, how are you type answers, when you meet a student for the first time, you can ask, what are the conditions like? Where do you come from when you come into a lesson? If you work with adult students, they may be coming right from work, or if you work with parents, they may be coming right from trying to put their children down for a nap, and that's the only time that they can come to see you. Those circumstances will tell you a lot about your student's frame of mind when they enter your space. And what we want to establish is a place where risk taking is safe and rewarded, where trying new things is celebrated as brave, where asking questions is honored, and where everything that a student is welcomed and celebrated. So instead of asking, how are you, you might start with your student and ask them, how did nap time go this afternoon? How is it outside? I haven't been out there in a few hours. And by asking your student to relate some details about the physical world around them, you very subtly give cues to their nervous system that you care about how they are, which is not something that's decided on a cognitive level. Safety is decided on a nervous system level. So I can hang up all of my pride stickers and all my mental health awareness posters. But if a student does not actually perceive safety in my studio on a nervous system level, all of my talk might be for nothing. So giving the nervous system time to acclimate to being in your working space, finding out how your student is relating to the world around them at this time. If a student comes in and you ask them, oh, how was the walk over from the biology building? And they say, oh, I don't even really know how I got here. That's a sign that their nervous system may be overwhelmed and processing too much. And so if a student has a really difficult time connecting with you in the moment, it's a sign to give them a little more space, a little more room to slow down. One of my favorite ways to start lessons is with breathing exercises, because we know that it's a fundamental component of what singers are doing anyway. And a fabulous breath exercise for present moment awareness, increasing coherence across the systems of the body, is to breathe in for 6 seconds and breathe out for 6 seconds. So breathing is absolutely a component of our practice and within our scope of ethical practice. But considering how your students are entering your space on any given day and applying breathing mindfully to how they show up takes our normal scope of practice and builds this layer of inclusivity, of recognizing, the student looks pretty overwhelmed and is going through a lot. I don't need to go through those details with them. I don't need to be their venting space if they've got other supports for that in their life. But without diving into yelling at them for not practicing or something, we can give some space to let the nervous system settle in our presence and then move on to our work. Some great guiding questions I ask my students are, what do you notice about that? Especially as we're developing new technical ideas and they're working on specific skill building. I also will invite us to take a second. Ooh, Let's take a second with that, especially if it looks like my student is starting to get really overwhelmed. We've all seen that singer face where they start to concentrate really hard on their internal experience because we've asked them to do something specific technically. And I have no qualms with this face and this sort of demonstration of um, working to process technical information. I will usually ask my students, I'll say, "Ooh, I see your thinking face, and I love that. Is there anything you need from me, or do you want to just continue gathering data and we'll talk again afterwards?" And my students are really used to that and are used to saying, "No, I think I have it. Just let me try it one more time." Or they'll say, "Oh, let me try that one again." And I can see that they are working to absorb the material in a way that works with their brain and their patterned thinking. Sometimes something happens and they go, "Whoa." And they seem almost unable to continue. And in those cases, I say, "Yeah, let's just give that a second. We don't need to go on right now. Feels like your brain is doing a lot, so let's just give it some time. You could take a few breaths, you can do a little tapping if you want to, you can take a walk, to the hallway if you want to just move your body a little bit, and I'll be right here when you're ready to go on." And again, this is a subtle way that I can convey safety on a nervous system level and also let my students know that however they learn best is welcome in our shared space. I also will notice sometimes if students have a real emotional reaction to something. Sometimes this has almost nothing to do with what I actually say. And I notice, especially with my students, they get more emotional when I give them genuine compliments and praise than anything else. I had a student recently who came back to school very quickly after the passing of her grandmother. She was very conscientious that it was the end of the semester and she had a number of deadlines and had to travel out of state to be with her family for the funeral and was very rushed in her process. She was in her lesson. She really wanted to work strategically on, she's a musical theater major, and we were working on classical technique and really pushing her technical understanding in new directions, learning a new skill. And she started to get frustrated with herself, which is very natural. And I said to her, "I notice you're getting frustrated." And she said, "Yes, I am." And as she tried to explain to me what was happening, she started to well up, and I could see she was just overwhelmed and trying her best to stay present and do what I was asking her to do. And in that moment, I said to her, "Do you want to talk about what's happening, or would you rather me pretend that nothing's going on?" She says, "Please pretend." And so I give my students that option. I never want to ignore the fact that something big is happening, because if a student is in my studio crying and I say nothing, what does that convey to them about my level of care and my level of awareness of their experience? I will always acknowledge a big emotional reaction, but I give the student the choice. Is this something you'd like to talk about now, or would you rather keep going with your work and circle back on this at another time? And then I always circle back with them at another time, either with an email or asking them to come to my office, or sometimes in their next lesson, they'll decide to talk about what has happened. Again, this is me creating that distinct boundary between, yes, I am becoming a somatic experiencing practitioner, but my job at UAB is to be a voice professor. So trying to be aware of nervous system processing, really sensitive and compassionate to my students' emotional states, but never entering into details of their emotional trauma without their express desire to do so at that time. Sometimes students will feel safe enough with you after time to open up about details of something. Again, we're not their therapists, and even therapists never need to get into the details of traumatic experience to move energy through the nervous system. But when this happens, if somebody says to me, I think honestly, I actually had a student say this to me once. I said, "What do you think that's about?" And he said, "Honestly, I think it's a childhood trauma." And I said, "Whoa." I mean, that was also our rapport at the time, that it would be totally in line with me for me to just go, "Whoa." Some things that we can say to students that normalize what they're noticing and experiencing are, wow, that sounds really big, or that sounds like a really important thing to have learned about yourself. A question I like to ask is, what supports exist in your life? This conveys to the students in a subtle way that I'm probably not the only person who should be aware of this information, and that there might be more appropriate places to process what it is they've learned. If students have no idea how to ask for help or where help exists, this is a time when I might say, would you like some help connecting to university resources, or are there folks in your family that you feel comfortable talking to about things like this, or do you have a friend or colleague, etc., etc. Which also, in a very subtle way, sort of hints at a professional boundary for me. I also ask my students, what could support from me look like? Admittedly, this is a challenging question. And the first time I had a friend ask me something like this during a difficult time in my life, I honestly had no idea how to answer. Eventually, I came upon, listen to me, which is the answer I most commonly get from students. I say, what would it be like to have support from me? What could that look like from me? And they say, listening. So more often than not, that's really what our students need from us. They don't need us to solve the problems. They don't need us to have all the details. But as they put together these pieces of their internal world, their technical skill building, what they're learning about anatomy, acoustics, biomechanics, everything, it's all together. There's really not these clear delineations of, now we're working on rib movement and nothing else. There's no component of our work that really exists that way. And so it's important for us to just consider that these emotional responses will be touched on, and being prepared for that and being prepared to hold that for students. My colleague Megan Durham titled her a recent workshop for Nats, Holding Space for Messy Things. And I think that's sometimes scary for us as teachers. So there is a call to us as professionals to expand our awareness of how our students are showing up and expand our capacity for compassionate listening and personal growth. As they grow as people, they grow as artists, and vice versa. So here's just a little primer on some of the things you can look for and notice. I'll look forward to your questions. If you're feeling really overwhelmed about this, fear not. I'll be delighted to talk to you a little bit more. And I'm also running a trauma-informed teacher cohort that's starting this fall, and you can learn more about that on my website, emilyjaworskikoriath.com. Thank you so much for tuning in, and let's get to the questions.